Hi, my name is Courtney Schlotman. This is my critical assignment on gait development for Kinesiology 332 at California Baptist University. For the toddler gait, it is drastically different than the adult's normal gait. His base of support is very wide. His stride length is a lot shorter. There is no arm swing for this toddler. His initial contact is not beginning with his heel. It is his entire foot. His mid stance, his tibia is not perpendicular, or is not, it's less perpendicular to the ground because his stance is so wide. For his terminal stance, his hips are not fully extended because his steps are so much shorter. From his pre-swing to his initial swing, his pre-swing does not show his toe off first. It's his entire foot coming off as well. For his initial swing to his mid-swing, his knee does not go into flexion. His steps are a lot more rounded compared to the adults. And then his late mid-swing to his terminal swing, when his knees are preparing for the terminal swings, his hip does not go into full extension. For child gait, his base of support is wider than the adults. It's still not as wide as the toddlers. He uses his arms to maintain his balance. His stride length, it is a lot shorter than the adults, and his initial contact is quicker because he's trying to maintain his balance. As far as his arm swing, there's not very much arm swing going on as far as when she's twirling around and when she's not just walking or running. Her initial contact into the loading response, it's not just when her heel is touching the ground. She walks a lot on her toes for when she strides. Her mid stance, her tibia is still less perpendicular to the ground than the adults. For the terminal stance, she has a lot less hip extension because her steps are so much shorter. For the pre-swing to the initial swing, it's her toes that are coming off first because she walks on her toes. For the initial swing to the mid-swing, her knee is not in full flexion. And then as far as her late mid-swing to the terminal swing, her knees are preparing to go into her terminal swing. Her hips are not in full extension, and her body does not shift forward to start the process over. This is a normal gait cycle. This is for the adults. And then for the base of support, the double limb support is in two phases, during initial contact and the loading response. And during the pre-swing. His stride length is determined by the initial contact of one foot and ends with the initial contact of the other. Each arm swing is during the motion of the opposite leg stride. As far as initial contact, the moving into the loading response, the heel touches the ground and then the weight is shifted to his leg. For mid stance, the tibia becomes perpendicular to the ground. The terminal stance, the hip extension occurs before the pre-swing, For pre-swing into the initial swing, knee flexion and toe off happens during. For the initial swing to the mid-swing, this is when the hip begins flexion while the knee continues flexion. The late mid-swing to terminal swing, during the mid-swing, his hip flexion occurs while his knee prepares for knee flexion. When the swing prepares for the terminal swing, there is maximum hip flexion, which also leads to full knee extension and then the body shifting forward to start the process over. This is for the elderly gait. The base of support is very, very narrow. The stride length is also determined by the initial contact of one foot to the initial contact of the other. It's really hard to determine with this elderly woman. Arm swing, only one arm is swinging while she keeps her other hand kind of on her hip so that she can keep balance. The initial contact to loading response, her initial contact is when her entire foot touches the ground, not her just normal heel. For the mid stance, her tibia does not become perpendicular to the ground. She does not extend her knees fully. Terminal stance, she has very little hip extension during this pre-swing. For a pre-swing into initial swing, there's slight knee flexion occurring, but there's no toe off during this pre-swing. The initial swing to mid-swing, the knee does not continue to flex, and then late mid-swing to terminal swing, her hips do flex when preparing for terminal swing. However, her knees do not prepare for flexion, and her body does not shift forward for the heel to strike, starting the process over. As far as what Haywood and Getchell say, as far as the theories and principles, there is the maturational perspective, and this is the motor development in an internal or innate process by the biological and genetic clock that we work off of. Normative description period is like a standardized test of norms. Biomechanical description period. This is a description of the movement patterns children use while performing fundamental skills. Another principle is information processing perspective. This is motor behavior and development in children. Ecological perspective. This is when this stresses the relationship between the individual and the environment during the task that someone's actually doing. For perception action approach, this is the relationship between the perceptual system and the motor skills and how they evolve together. So when you are actually doing something, this is all the motor systems working together as one. And move me really quick. So gait abnormality in each stage of development. As far as the toddler, child, normal, and elderly, the abnormality really affects a toddler, child, and elderly. The normal gait looked fine. As far as the toddler, the toddlers had a wide base, a really short stride. There was little to no arm swing. There was no heel touching for the initial contact. Also, not just heel touching, but the child also walked on her tippy toes. Hips not fully extend during the terminal stance as well. And then as far as the child gait, she has a very wide base. She has really short strides. There's no arm swing. She tiptoes around. Her tibia is way less perpendicular to the ground. She walks on her toes during the pre-swing to the initial swing, and her body does not shift forward to the terminal stance. And as far as the elderly gait, there was quite a bit of abnormalities in her stages. Very narrow base. Her stride length is very short. It's hard to even determine the initial contact. There's little to no single heel contact. Her knees are not fully extending. There's no flexion during the mid-swing. Her body does not shift forward to complete the terminal stage. Move me again. So the possible constraints, both physical and perceptual, at each stage of development includes the most common type of gait abnormalities in children are in-toeing and out-toeing. So what in-toeing is when you walk with your toes in, and then out-toeing is walking with your feet turned outwards. In-toeing and out-toeing are not usually painful. There are several conditions that can cause your child's feet to turn inward or outward in their early years, including tibial torsion and femoral rotation. Each of these conditions typically improve on their own during childhood. In elderly adult gait, progressively loses automaticity and imposes higher demands on already declining frontal dependent executive control resources. This is parallel losses in motor coordination and executive function challenge the ability to cope effectively with mobility tasks. And so that is something that will affect the elderly gait process. And this is my reference page. Thank you so much. Have a good one.